The most disturbing mutiny and shipwreck in history by the time the smoke was finally seen on the horizon. Whatever had gone wrong here was already beyond saving. Dozens were dead, many more would soon follow, and the place where it happened was silent in a way that only follows prolonged terror. This was not the result of a sudden storm or an unlucky collision with the sea. Nature played its part, but it was human decisions, deliberate and calculated, that turned survival into something far worse. Those who lived through it would later struggle to explain how quickly order collapsed, how authority dissolved, and how ordinary people became instruments of cruelty. At the center of it all was a small group who understood that fear could be more powerful than weapons, and that isolation could erase morality. By the time help arrived, the damage was irreversible. Entire families were gone. Trust had been replaced by suspicion, and survival had become guilt. What happened here remains one of the disturbing episodes recorded, not because of how many died, but because of what the living were forced to endure. Months earlier, everything had appeared orderly, even optimistic. The mission itself was unremarkable by the standards of the time, a long voyage across hostile waters carrying people, supplies, and wealth toward a distant destination where profit and prestige awaited. Ships like this departed ports every year, and most arrived without incident. From the outside, there was little reason to believe this journey would be any different. Yet beneath that surface calm, instability was already present. Authority was divided in ways that encouraged rivalry rather than cooperation. Ranks overlapped, responsibilities blurred, and respect was expected rather than earned. Small disagreements went unresolved, quietly hardening into resentment. No one viewed these tensions as dangerous. They were treated as inconveniences, the kind that time and discipline were supposed to smooth out. The environment itself reinforced that illusion of control. Days passed with predictable routines, familiar duties, and long stretches of monotony that lulled everyone into complacency. It was easy to believe the greatest threats lay outside the ship, in storms or navigation errors, rather than within the people sharing its space. What no one fully understood was how fragile that order truly was. The systems meant to maintain stability depended on trust, and trust was already eroding. All it would take was isolation and pressure for everything holding this world together to unravel. Among the passengers was a man who did not quite fit the rhythm of the voyage. He held a position of respect but not command, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who believed himself smarter than those above him. He listened more than he talked, watching how authority was exercised and where it faltered. He questioned rules quietly, often framing doubt as philosophy rather than defiance. Order, he suggested, was an illusion upheld only because people agreed to believe in it. When discipline failed, he claimed it was not a moral failing, but proof that the system itself was flawed. To some, these ideas sounded thoughtful, even enlightened. To others, they were unsettling. What made him dangerous was not anger or violence, but patience. He understood resentment better than loyalty, and he knew how to nurture it without appearing responsible for it. Small grievances were validated, shared, and reframed as injustices. He never asked for action directly. He only asked questions that lingered. As weeks passed, his presence subtly altered the atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter when certain officers approached. Doubt replaced confidence. People began to imagine alternative futures, ones where hierarchy was unnecessary and consequences negotiable. No one confronted him, because nothing he did was overtly wrong. Yet something was shifting. Beliefs were loosening, identities softening, and allegiance becoming conditional. Long before disaster struck, the foundation was already weakening. It happened quietly, deliberately, and without resistance from anyone. The moment everything failed came without warning. There was no time to prepare, no gradual realization, only a violent interruption that turned routine into panic. In an instant, authority lost its meaning. Orders were shouted, ignored, contradicted, and then abandoned altogether as survival replaced structure. People moved without coordination, driven by instinct rather than instruction. Some tried to save others. Some tried only to save themselves. The safeguards that had kept fear in check were gone, and with them vanished the assumption that someone was in control. The environment became hostile not because it had changed, but because the rules that governed it no longer applied. Confusion spread faster than information. No one knew how bad the damage truly was or how much time remained. Decisions were made hastily, often contradicting earlier plans, and every choice carried irreversible consequences. Those who hesitated were left behind. Those who acted quickly often did so blindly. When the chaos finally settled, what remained was isolation. Separated from help, resources, and certainty, the survivors were forced into a reality where survival was no longer temporary, but indefinite. Leadership fractured, responsibility dispersed, and accountability disappeared. From that moment forward, there was no returning to what had existed before. The disaster had not just destroyed safety. It had erased restraint, and whatever followed would unfold without protection or oversight. Every mistake would now be paid slowly. With no clear leader to oppose him, he stepped forward calmly, presenting himself not as a tyrant, but as a solution. Order, he said, was still possible, but only if difficult choices were accepted. Fear made people receptive. Hunger made them obedient. At first, his commands seemed reasonable. Resources had to be controlled. Movement had to be restricted. Weapons needed to be centralized for safety. Each decision was framed as temporary, necessary, and regrettable. Few objected, because refusing meant becoming a problem. Then came separation. Certain groups were sent away under the pretense of searching for supplies. Others were isolated for being weak, sick, or disruptive. No one was killed outright at first. Responsibility was diluted, spread thin enough that no single person felt accountable. As days passed, the line between protection and punishment disappeared. Disobedience became danger. Silence became survival. People learned quickly what behaviors were rewarded and which ones led to disappearance. Fear was no longer a reaction, it was a system. What made the violence escalate was not chaos, but routine. Cruel acts were normalized through repetition and justification. Victims were reduced to burdens, then obstacles, then nothing at all. By the time blood was shed openly, resistance felt pointless. The moral threshold had already been crossed. He rarely acted directly. Orders passed through others, creating distance and plausible denial. But his influence was everywhere. Control no longer required force. It lived in anticipation, compliance, and the quiet understanding that mercy had become optional. By then, cruelty felt inevitable, and survival meant participating or vanishing entirely alone, while terror tightened its grip in one place. It failed to reach everyone. Away from the center of control, a smaller group found itself abandoned rather than eliminated. Cut off, undersupplied, and presumed doomed, they faced the same environment without the same supervision. At first, survival was accidental. They discovered drinkable water where none was expected, food where scarcity was assumed. Each small success reinforced something that had been missing elsewhere: cooperation. Roles emerged naturally. Decisions were debated, not enforced. Instead of fear, necessity shaped behavior. Unaware of the full extent of the atrocities unfolding elsewhere, they focused on endurance. Simple defenses were improvised. Watch rotations were established. Signals were prepared, not knowing whether they would ever be seen. Every precaution carried an unspoken urgency, as if time itself were an enemy. Meanwhile, the violence continued to escalate beyond their reach. With each passing day, the gap between these two realities widened. One side descended further into domination and cruelty. The other hardened quietly, learning how to survive without surrendering control. What neither group fully understood was how close they were to colliding again. Rescue, confrontation, or annihilation loomed just beyond the horizon. Survival was no longer just about staying alive. It was about whether resilience could outpace brutality before one erased the other completely. There was no margin left. When contact was finally made, the confrontation ended quickly, not because mercy prevailed, but because the truth could no longer be contained. Those who had ruled through fear were exposed the moment authority returned. Resistance, once fragile, suddenly mattered. Justice followed, but it was uneven. Some were punished harshly, others escaped full accountability, and many answers were buried with the dead. Survival itself became complicated. Those who lived carried not only relief, but responsibility, knowing what had been done in their presence. In the end, the numbers told the story more clearly than any testimony. Far fewer survived than began the journey, and most losses were not caused by the disaster that stranded them. They were caused by people. What remains is a cautionary tale, but a reminder of how thin the line is between order and cruelty. Given the right conditions, civilization fades, choice by choice, until nothing remains.